Hey guys, imagine this. You're standing in the golden light of ancient Persia, the richest empire the world had ever seen. Behind palace walls draped in silk and guarded by silent eunuchs, women ruled entire estates, whispered to kings, and carried the empire's most dangerous secrets. They commanded armies of servants, oversaw caravans of gold and wine, and yet their names were almost erased from history. So before you settle in, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is where you are. It is always fascinating hearing where people are from across the globe. Now dim the lights, get comfortable. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's journey through history together to uncover a world where not everything stayed buried. Beneath the ruins of Persepolis, thousands of clay tablets were found, each one recording their hidden power, their hunger, their fear, and their quiet defiance. In the high desert of Fars, the massive terraces of Persepolis rose like a carved vision, institutional majesty girded by columns, reliefs of tribute-bearers, and the hush of stone. This was the center of the Achaemenid imperial project under Darius and his successors, but beneath the polished image of power lay a repository of clay fragments, tablets baked by fire, which reveal the quieter lives of the women whom conventional histories often omit. These tablets are the first traces of hidden lives. When Alexander's armies set Persepolis ablaze in 330 BCE, much of the royal palace and its records went up in smoke. Yet the clay tablets, the administrative ledgers, rations logs, seal impressions, survived the inferno. As the burning baked them, they hardened. Thus, what the empire tried to destroy, in part, became one of our best windows into daily life. This collection is called the Persepolis Fortification Archive, or Persepolis Fortification Tablets. The archive comprises thousands of tablets, chiefly in Elamite and some in Aramaic, cataloguing distributions of grain, wine, oil, and other staples to workers, travelers, officials, and the royal household. Though they appear mundane, lists of measures, names, seals, they are revolutionary in what they reveal. Women are routinely present in these records, sometimes in roles of responsibility. In the past, ancient historians, especially Greek sources, framed Persian women as passive, sequestered, or manipulated behind curtains. But the clay archives tell a more complex story. They show women not only as recipients of rations, but as property owners, estate managers, supervisors, and travelers. The silence of narrative histories is pierced by the voices of receipts, seals, and lists. Thus the first dark secret begins. Women's administrative and economic presence was often hidden behind bureaucratic routine rather than grand narrative. We must learn to read those routines closely. The tablets use different terms to refer to women, indicating social distinctions. In some sources, the designations mutu, irti, and duxis appear, where mutu seems to apply to ordinary women and irti, duxis, appear with royal women. Such linguistic distinctions hint at a layered female social order, part of which remains opaque to us. Royal and noble women occupy a spatial and symbolic presence in the palaces and reliefs, queens, daughters, mothers, but the tablets sometimes bring them into the same ledger lines as estate owners. In some cases, royal women signed documents with their own seals and received rations for travel, but rank still mattered. A daughter of a king, a principal wife, or a queen mother might hold larger holdings, travel with retinues, or issue orders through agents. Lower status women, or those in ordinary households, rarely left a personal seal or a named signature. The elite women, therefore, sometimes straddled public and private jurisdiction. In some, female status in Achaemenid Persia was not monolithic. It ranged from laboring women to court magnates. But the social ladder was steep, and many of the women on lower rungs remain nameless in the archives. One of the most striking revelations in the tablets is that some women, including non-royal ones, held property and managed estates. They were not merely silent dependents. They could issue orders, contract for supplies, and direct workers. The case of Irdabama is emblematic. She appears in the archives with her own seal and in records ordering distributions across multiple provinces. According to the records, she commanded nearly 480 workers, shipped wine and grain to far-flung estates, and coordinated storage facilities. Scholars debate whether she was a royal woman or a privileged noble, but she certainly wielded more than subsidiary influence. Another example is Artistone, a wife of Darius I. The texts refer to multiple estates under her name, letters and seals attributed to her, and agents collecting rents. Other royal women, such as Parysatis, wife of Darius VI, also appear in archival and Greek sources with holdings and influence. In these administrative interactions, women often operated via intermediaries, stewards, managers, bailiffs, but the backing behind those agents was not always male. The daily ledgers record land, foodstuffs, storage, taxation, and labor under women's oversight. It is especially telling that in some instances, women received rations or payments equal to or exceeding those of men in the same workforce, especially when they held supervisory titles. In at least one tablet, a woman traveling for official business carried a seal enabling her to collect provisions at way stations, just as male couriers did. Thus, the women of the estates navigated complex authority. Their power was real, though often mediated and indirect, and much of it remains hidden behind routine bureaucratic entries. The clay tablets and Greek writings whisper of queens, whose influence could shift borders and intrigue could weave through court corridors. Etossa was born the daughter of Cyrus the Great and later became the wife of Darius I, mother of Xerxes I, and queen mother during Xerxes' reign. Her life spanned the reigns of multiple kings. She held a position of unique vantage, straddling generations. Her name appears in Greek sources, especially Herodotus, and she is sometimes portrayed as counselor, conspirator, or kingmaker. In the Persian administrative archives, we find hints of her domain. While not all seals bearing her name survive or can be uniquely attributed, Atossa had at least one house or domain and likely managed estates. Her role in public life is visible in later tradition. In Greek narrative, she is credited with persuading Darius to campaign in Greece and with maintaining influence in royal councils. What is less visible is her emotional position. A woman who sees sons crowned, intrigues flourish, and royal transitions flicker like flames. She must balance public dignity, private fears, and the limitations of being a queen among many. Her consort status and role as mother placed her in a complex tension, powerful yet always circumscribed by the king's prerogative and the protocols of the royal family. Atossa's long life allowed her to be both active and overshadowed. The continuity she represented made her counsel valued, but her presence also attracted suspicion from rivals. Because she existed in later memory as much as in archives, we must read her name as both historical actor and mythic figure. The role of a king's wife was never safe from rumor. Among the better documented royal consorts is Amestris, wife of Xerxes I. Greek sources, especially Ctesias, a physician writing in Persian courts, present her as a ruthless avenger and powerful manipulator. Ctesias tells how Xerxes gave a robe made by Amestris to another woman. Amestris allegedly retaliated violently, ordering the older woman to be mutilated. She is also accused of orchestrating retaliations on the families of Maria and manipulating the royal succession after Xerxes' death. These stories are dramatic, but they come through Greek lenses, often intended to portray the Oriental despot tropes, women as vengeful, capricious, exotic. Modern scholars caution that such portrayals must be balanced with indigenous evidence. Still, The repeated motifs of vengeance, betrayal, and fear in Herodotean and Ctesian narratives point toward the pressure royal women faced. Pressure to protect dynastic integrity, rivalries, jealousy, and the need to defend children's claims. One lesser-known but revealing case involves a daughter of Xerxes, Amytis. According to Ctesias, she was accused of adultery with a Greek physician, and when the affair was discovered, the physician was tortured and killed, reportedly at a mistress's insistence. Whether that is true, exaggerated, or allegory, it shows how the lives of royal women were vulnerably tied to honor, reputation, secrecy, and rumor. A single whisper could lead to death. A mistress image tells us something about the dark underside of female authority in a male-dominated court. She could be queen, but also villain in public narrative. The Greek rhetorical traditions cast her as archetypal Eastern queen, overshadowing whatever real political or economic role she may have had. Yet her name persists, forced into memory, carved in narrative blame, even when she remains inscribed but silent in the Persian administrative traces. A third royal figure is Artistone, also known by the Elamite name Irtashduna, a daughter of Cyrus and one of the wives of Darius the Fur. In the Persepolis tablets, her name occurs on letters and estate documents with her seal. Artistone's presence in the tablets suggests that royal women did more than symbolically hold estates. They actively engaged in estate management, correspondence, and economic networks. Her estates had stewards and bailiffs, and her agents collected rents and managed storage houses. That she appears in the same administrative record as major estate holders means the boundary between king's property and queen's property was often porous and negotiated. The archival women seal their own letters and have permitted access to provisioning systems. Royal women likely held parallel courts, small administrative networks inside the palace, through which they exercised soft authority, distributing favors, hosting banquets, adjudicating disputes among dependents, and overseeing familial alliances. These courts seldom appear in Greek histories, but their traces linger in the clay. While we have glimpses of power, the darkness shows in what is absent. None of these women say in the tablets what they feel. None record how they contend with rivalry, betrayal, fear, or the risk that the king's favor might shift. The archives don't inscribe jealousy or spite. Instead, they list deliveries, names, seals, yet tensions must have sharpened behind closed doors. The competition among wives and concubines, the desire to protect children's inheritance, the management of agents and estates, all these provided fertile ground for intrigue. Mothers might watch as younger women bore the king's next child. Advisors might shift toward a son, leaving a mother's counsel muted. Dissenters in the court could whisper against a queen's influence. The public narrative blamed women like Amestris for cruelty or vengeance. But the lived secret was a perilous balance: use power and risk slander, remain silent and lose influence. In these hallways, shadows lengthened. A seal may record that a queen sent grain to Ecbatana, but it cannot tell us whether she trembled at hearing footsteps in the corridor or heard her enemies whisper in her sepulchral quarters. The tablets and Greek tales together draw us closer, but always leave us longing to open the private door. Beneath the monumental courts and estates, life for most Persian women was shaped by marriage, family obligations, household labor, and legal constraints. Their stories are rarely told in full, yet fragments from Aramaic contracts, Babylonian legal texts under Achaemenid rule, and the Persepolis administrative archives hint at the tensions and contradictions of daily existence. One of the clearest legal sites in which women's status appears is in marriage contracts, especially from Babylonian, Elamite, and Egyptian territories under Persian rule. Although we must caution that these documents reflect local legal traditions as much as Persian policy, they offer critical glimpses. In Babylonian marriage contracts from the Achaemenid period, women's dowries were formalized. A bride's family might provide land, jewelry, household goods, money, or even slaves. The husband usually accepted the dowry via a sealed document. If the husband took a second wife, the contracts often required him to compensate the first wife. Women could own and manage property independent of their husbands. After a husband's death, a widow could inherit, even if she had children or not. However, there were limits. A woman could not act as a legal witness in contract drawing, though she could be a contracting party and use her own seal. These contracts often stipulated conditions of divorce. If the husband divorced his wife, he had to grant her a share of property or assets. If she initiated divorce, she might have to return what was provided as dowry or bride price. Sons and daughters sometimes inherited equally, but in local practice, many contract sets allocated portions differently. Although we have no perfect parallel set of contracts from core Persian territories, it is plausible that similar legal norms applied, either by Persian adaptation of local codes or through overlap. Persian imperial policy often allowed subject territories to keep their legal traditions. Thus, the dark secret is that many women negotiated within a patchwork legal world, sometimes with real rights, but always within constraints they had little control over. Everyday life demanded far more than legal rights. Most women oversaw households, feeding, weaving, childcare, managing stores, supervising servants or slaves, and arranging seasonal food reserves. These activities rarely appear in high politics, but they shaped survival. In rural provinces, women might assist in agricultural tasks, harvesting, planting, tending domestic animals. In urban homes, women spun wool, wove cloth, and processed foodstuffs. The archives of Persepolis, while largely focused on staple goods and labor distributions, do show that women sometimes appeared in mixed work groups. According to Dandamayev in the Persepolis worker lists, about 39.8% of the names belonged to women. Yet such participation did not necessarily equate to equality. Supervisory roles, heavier functions, or protection from abuse might still tilt toward male staff. The hidden tension. Even when women worked side by side with men, cultural, social, or legal norms likely limited their decision-making autonomy or exposed them to pressure behind the scenes. A further dark secret lies in the emotional burden and unrecorded toil. Childbirth, infant loss, managing domestic illness, maintaining networks of kinship and patronage, and negotiating household debt or seasonal famine. The tablets do not pass these. They record grain, wine, and oil, but not heartbreak, illness, or fear. Those were unwritten. In a world where identity was signaled by seals, rank, and public display, clothing and appearance held weight for women. In the Achaemenid period, women, particularly in the elite classes, wore robes made of fine wool, linen, and imported fabrics, sometimes dyed and edged with ornaments. Some reconstructions show pleated robes, mantles, veils, or head coverings, and hair styled in braids or under veils, depending on status. We find no reliefs of women carved openly in Persepolis palaces, no grand stone images of royal women present in the public stairways or columns. One archaeologist recently noted that palatial reliefs depict servants or procession figures often mistaken for women, but they are likely male attendants. Instead, women exist in the minor arts, seals, jewelry, textiles, and small-scale imagery. Their absence from stone reliefs might disclose a deliberate invisibility or a cultural choice in monumental art. This invisibility at scale becomes a secret in itself. Women present in everyday power, but systematically omitted from the visual narrative of empire. Clothing also marked rank and association. A queen's robes would be sumptuous, dyed, decorated. A woman from a lesser class wore more modest textiles. Outsiders, slaves, servants wore simple wool or linen. The subtle gradations in fabric, color, cut and ornament signaled social boundaries. The public eye read clothing. A misstep in dress could invite scrutiny or censure, especially for women moving across courts or provinces. One might expect royal or elite women to participate in temple rituals, votive acts, or religious offices. Yet in Achaemenid Persia, evidence of women's ritual roles is scant. The fortification tablets do not record women performing temple offices. Neither Greek sources nor Persian administrative texts clearly place royal women in Zoroastrian cult leadership. That said, the Persian religious system did include a significant female divinity, Anahita, goddess of water, fertility, and healing. Before major military campaigns or royal undertakings, kings sought ritual blessings at her temples, for instance, at Ecbatana. But nothing in surviving sources unequivocally describes women officiating in Anahita's rites at the same level as male priests. This absence is telling. The public, sacred domain remained largely male, even while secular estate domains admitted women. That disjunction is part of the unspoken boundary of female power. Thus, women lived between religious exclusion and secular presence, a tension they could rarely articulate or document. Within those structures, women likely practiced quiet resistance, negotiation, and small acts of agency. A widow might defend her claim in local courts. A mistress might intercede with agents or petition tax collectors. Women might use familial networks or ritual gifts to secure protection or favor. They might send children away for education or marriage. They might withhold information, delay deliveries, or quietly reshape estates. While the archives cannot capture those subtleties, the presence of women's seals, the variation in rations, and the patterns of estate management suggest these were lived strategies. One woman, Irdabama, sent agents to remote provinces and managed a network of estates crossing imperial boundaries. Her very existence is testament to the margin women could expand, but also to how much we must imagine the emotional and social labor behind her orders. If power and property left faint impressions of women in the Achaemenid world, illness and the body pressed their names more urgently into memory. Rations in the Persepolis system were not random gifts, but structured entitlements that varied by rank, task, age, and sex. The administrative project that Halleck published from the Persepolis Fortification Archive shows an economy where persons in the state's orbit receive standardized distributions. The scale could rise for certain recipients, and scholars use these increases to infer care for vulnerable groups, including mothers and infants. The tablets are dry in tone, but their arithmetic speaks of real bodies that needed more calories to survive. Behind those entries stood midwives, attendants, and women's networks that the state did not count. The archives record the outcome, not the hands. Surviving Near Eastern evidence suggests an early age at marriage and long spans of childbearing, when a woman who lived beyond childhood might face pregnancy many times and nurse for years, using lactation as a natural brake on conception. Scholarship on ancient pregnancy offers a stark picture. If nutrition and workload were favorable, women could live long, but childbirth was the gate through which many never passed. The danger was both medical and social. A woman's health was her family's survival strategy, and an illness could become a debt, a sale of assets, or a shift in household power. One royal illness survives in unusual detail. Herodotus tells that Atossa, daughter of Cyrus and wife of Darius, found a swelling on her breast. Shame kept her silent until the wound worsened. Only then did she summon the Greek physician Democedes, a captive who had already impressed the court. He treated her and won favor, which he used to push for a reconnaissance to Greek shores. Greek writers link that cure to later imperial designs, as if a queen's body tilted the empire toward war. Even allowing for Herodotus's taste for drama, the episode gives us something rare. A Persian woman named not for a dowry or a seal, but for pain, fear, and the trust she placed in a physician from a foreign school. Atossa's story opens two doors. The first leads into court medicine, where healers from Egypt and Greece competed for prestige and access. Ctesias, a Greek doctor who served later under Artaxerxes II, wrote tall tales about Persia and India that ancient authors quoted and modern historians treat with caution. His presence at court is not in doubt. The Persian palace was a hub where methods crossed, reputations were made, and women's ailments could become political currency. A queen's recovery might confirm a physician's status. A failure could end a career. The second door leads toward women's secrecy. Atossa hid her tumor for shame. That detail has the sticky feel of truth. Across ancient societies, illness in the breast or womb touched both modesty and fertility, the core of how elite families bargained with each other through marriages and heirs. To tell of such illness risked more than gossip. It risked a woman's future influence and her children's place. Beyond the court, ritual boundaries shaped what counted as illness and who could care for it. Zoroastrian purity law hardened in later periods and is first seen clearly in texts like the Vendidad. These sources are later than the early Achaemenids and must be handled carefully, yet they attest to ideals that would crystallize in Sasanian Iran. Menstruation, stillbirth, and contact with blood could render a woman ritually impure, obliging seclusion and prescribed washings before re-entry to communal life. The rules placed a burden on women, but they also organized care, space, and time around a cycle that everyone understood. Purity was not only a moral teaching, it functioned as a public health logic of sorts in a world without germ theory, separating pollution from fire, water, and sacred space. Even so, the ritual obligations made women's bodies the stage on which a community performed its anxiety about decay and death. A woman's medical world then sat at the junction of three systems. The third was ritual, where priests and families negotiated periods of separation and return to purity. These systems could help or harm. They could combine into a net that held a woman through childbirth, or they could tighten into a noose if illness made her unclean, unproductive, or suspect. The harm is easier to see in silence. The tablets cannot tell us how often postpartum fever carried a mother away. They do not say how many infant funerals passed beneath carved staircases. They cannot fix our eye on the woman who bled in a courtyard, while the household debated which rules outweighed which needs. The few near-contemporary hints from the archive are suggestive rather than explicit. When we find a special provisioning for a group of women on the move with children, we can imagine a supervised relocation for work or a seasonal transfer of dependents. When we see a name tied to wine distributions more generous than average, we might infer status, celebration, or prescription. Medicine itself was a marketplace of methods. Persian elites had access to Egyptian practitioners and Greek physicians. The court rewarded success, and stories about gentler Greek techniques compared to Egyptian regimens circulate in later retellings of Democedes' cures. Such comparisons carry ethnocentric bias, but they also reflect a cosmopolitan medical scene in which women's treatment could become a contest of schools and temperaments. For an elite woman, a royal doctor might bring poultices, knives, or dietetics. For a village woman, care was whatever knowledge older women held and whatever herbs and prayers could be spared from a small store. Between those ends stretched a range of informal practitioners whose names the archives never taught us to read. Some of the darkest costs were political. Within the palace, outside the palace, the same rules might protect a woman from exhausting duties for a few days each month. Inside, they might remove her from a crucial audience or delay a petition until a rival had shaped the king's mood. A system built to order the world easily became a tool that reordered women's prospects in the smallest details of timing. When we return to the ledgers, we see again the state's abstraction. It lists persons and measures. It fixes need into numbers. It cannot grasp the tremor in Atossa's hand as she finally sent for help. It cannot say how many women hid their pain, because to name it was to empower enemies. And yet the ledgers, Herodotus's story, and the later ritual text together map a contour of women's lives that is as intimate as it is imperial. Bodies were the first archive. Clay came after. By the mid-5th century BCE, the Achaemenid Empire had woven its ideology of hierarchy into everything from law to clothing. Gender boundaries, like social rank, were material, visible, and rehearsed daily. For women, especially those below the elite, silence was both shield and constraint, the most pervasive, dark secret in Persian life. Textual and visual evidence suggests that respectable women of status veiled when leaving private space. Greek authors such as Xenophon and Curtius Rufus describe Persian noblewomen traveling enclosed in carriages and screened by curtains. Archaeologists have found bronze and textile fragments of head coverings in elite burials from the Achaemenid heartland, and later Iranian iconography continues the motif. Iranica, women eye, pre-Islamic Persia. The veil was never merely about modesty. It performed separation between those whose honor was guarded and those whose labor was public. Enslaved women, workers, and foreigners went unveiled. Royal or noble women hid their faces not because they were powerless, but because visibility was privilege rationed by class and gender. To appear unveiled before unrelated men could invite legal or social punishment. Yet the rule also concealed power. Within the curtained carriage or behind palace screens, women conducted business, received emissaries, and issued instructions through stewards. The same barrier that excluded them from public squares gave them private arenas of authority. The paradox defined Persian womanhood, unseen yet omnipresent in domestic, economic, and diplomatic networks. Below the noble women were those whose voices never reached clay or parchment. Slavery in Achaemenid Persia was less racial than economic and punitive. Captives from conquered lands filled workshops, kitchens, and estates. Dandamaev, Slavery in Babylonia, 1984. Women slaves appear in the Persepolis tablets as laborers and recipients of rations, sometimes with infants listed beside them. They ground grain, brewed beer, spun wool, and baked for army supply trains. Some were war captives. Others were debt slaves or hereditary servants bound to a noble house. Their lives were measured by output and subsistence, not by ceremony. Abuse was unrecorded, manumission rare. Yet even here, gradations existed. Certain women rose to supervisory positions, ardat or forewoman, distributing rations and maintaining order among work crews. These glimpses remind us that within bondage, some carved micro-hierarchies of survival. Halleck, Persepolis fortification texts, November 1234 to 1280. To speak publicly was dangerous. The empire's ideology identified the king as the mouth of truth, Arta. So unauthorized speech could sound like rebellion. Women's petitions, when preserved on Aramaic papyri from Elephantine and Bactria, follow rigid formulas, deferential greetings, invocation of royal justice, self-effacement. Azoni 2021, Women and Property in Persian Egypt. For most, silence was prudence. Words could travel farther than intention. Inside the household, however, women shaped language through story, chant, and lament. Zoroastrian tradition, though recorded centuries later, preserves women's ritual roles in mourning and purification. The domestic liturgy of washing, fire tending, and food offering was often female work. Speech here became sacred, but bounded by walls. The empire wrote no poems of mothers teaching prayers. It left them to oral memory. Persian moral order fused family honor with female behavior. Adultery was a capital offense under both Babylonian and later Avestan law. Even rumor could destroy status. Ctesias' tales of queens mutilating rivals may exaggerate, but they draw from a genuine anxiety. A woman's body symbolized lineage purity. Ctesias, from a 1520 via Photius. In provincial courts, judges treated sexual crimes as assaults on property as much as persons. Marriage alliances thus carried surveillance. Elite wives traveled with eunuchs. Castrated men considered safe guardians. Eunuchs held trusted administrative posts precisely because their disconnection from procreation made them neutral in dynastic competition. For women, that meant perpetual supervision, every outing mediated, every letter sealed through another's hands. Within these strictures, secrecy itself became an art. The most adept women learned to use ambiguity, gestures, gifts, silences as language. The historian Maria Brosius notes that royal women often spoke through seals, a symbolic act that conveyed authority without the exposure of direct speech. Brosius, Women in Ancient Persia, 1996. An oval seal pressed into clay could summon caravans or dismiss officials. Yet to outsiders it looked like a decorative token. Letters from the Aramaic archives of Bactria show similar patterns. Orders phrased as polite requests, approvals cloaked in ritual blessings. Such textual disguises allowed women to influence without appearing to command. The empire's etiquette demanded that the illusion of male control remain intact, even when female initiative set events in motion. Silence, veil, and surveillance protected the social order, but exacted a toll. The palace was a labyrinth of listening ears. One ill-chosen word could echo in the wrong hall. For non-royal women, dependence on male kin meant constant calculation. When to ask, whom to trust, how to hide small possessions or feelings. Diaries or letters of emotion have not survived. Grief and resentment must be inferred from the cracks in official prose. Greek envoys described Persian women as secluded and melancholy, though we cannot know if those impressions came from genuine observation or Orientalist fantasy. Still, any system that polices movement and speech breeds private yearning. The darkness of ancient Persian womanhood was not only oppression, it was loneliness enforced by etiquette. If palaces and ledgers outlined the limits of women's lives, religion traced the lines in fire and water. In the Achaemenid world, belief was not an abstract comfort but a grammar for daily action. The empire's official cult centered on truth, order, and the sacred elements. Priests guarded ritual purity. Kings invoked heaven in monumental inscriptions. Ordinary families arranged their days around rules of clean and unclean. Within that frame, women moved with both constraint and ingenuity, claiming small, persistent forms of spiritual authority that left few direct records. By the later Achaemenid period, most Greek observers recognized the royal house and priesthood as Zoroastrian in practice, even though the early kings' beliefs remain debated. The sources we trust link Western Iranian cult life to the Magi, a hereditary priestly class whose charge included tending sacred fire, reciting prayers, and maintaining ritual order. In Old Persian and Elamite records, and in Greek reports, the Magi appear as the recognizable face of Iranian religion in public life. Their title is the only one consistently applied to priests across successive Western Iranian empires. Sacred water, no less than fire, shaped devotion. The great Iranian divinity Anahita personified rivers and healing springs and was invoked for fertility, health, and victory. Later, classical writers say Artaxerxes too set up her statues in major cities. The archaeological trail is thin for the Achaemenid heartland, but Iranian scholarship keeps returning to her cult and the royal attention it drew. Where political and military power needed divine favor, Anahita's name rose with it, linking royal households to a feminine, life-giving presence. These public features of worship framed a private world in which women were the first guardians of water in daily life. At the scale of the household, the person who fetched, stored, and protected clean water often determined whether a family remained ritually fit. The same was true of domestic fire, which women tended and fed. Historians cannot point to many named priestesses in Achaemenid sources, but we can see how women sustained the two elements that priests exalted and kings invoked. Their competence underwrote male ritual, even if men performed it. Laws of purity, recorded fully only in later Zoroastrian texts, give us an imperfect window on tendencies forming in the Achaemenid era. Menstruation, miscarriage, and childbirth appear as periods requiring seclusion, washing, and careful management of contact with fire and water. The legal imagination saw blood and decay as peril to sacred elements and to communal order. That placed the weight of ritual discipline on women's bodies. Later codifications map out enclosures, timed washings, and strict rules for returning to ordinary life. Scholars urge caution in projecting late law onto the 5th century, yet the broad picture is consistent with earlier sensibilities about purity. Ritual regulation cut both ways. In farms and villages, seclusion could spare a woman from hardest labor and enforce a measure of rest. In courts and garrisons, the same rules could be turned against her, excluding her from audiences or rites at decisive moments. Because the state and the priesthood treated purity as a public value, household disputes over care and timing acquired religious gravity. In those arguments, the empire's ideology entered kitchens and birthing rooms, and women learned to negotiate doctrine as survival. The clay archive from Persepolis, though dry in tone, registers people traveling under the empire's protection to sanctuaries and administrative centers. It also records distributions tagged to religious functions. From those lists, we know that rations were not only for building crews and couriers. The same bureaucratic hand that measured grain for work gangs measured grain for those attached to cult service and for travelers on official business. Where the tablets name women moving with children or supplies on sanctioned routes, we glimpse households aligned to sacred obligations as well as economic ones. The archive's logic reduces persons to measures, but the categories hint at a world where the religious and the practical interlocked. If priests stood at the visible altar, women often moved just beyond the documented edge. They supplied offerings, prepared pure food, and taught the language of blessing to the very children who would one day repeat prayers before fire. The records do not preserve their formulas. Their existence is written in the consistency with which the state provisioned rituals and in the steady presence of women's names alongside distributions to estates that funded cultic life. Greek writers blur the line between magi as priests and magicians as wonder-workers. Iranian sources distinguish them more carefully, yet admit a grey zone of practices not sanctioned by public liturgy. The formal cult praised truth and order and denounced deception. Sorcery appears in later law codes as a moral and religious threat. That stance, taken seriously, makes informal ritual a risky craft. The result is a paradox. The same society that relied on women to keep water clean and fire alive also cast suspicion on unsanctioned charms and whispers. Family life does not stop for law, so the grey zone persisted. A mother might knot a thread and recite a prayer over a feverish child. A grandmother might put a protective mark on a doorway when a caravan left for winter roads. The priest would call for prayer and the physician for poultices. Women often did both, while the men argued methods. The historian can only reconstruct these practices indirectly, since the archive prefers distributions to incantations and the inscriptions "Honor Kings," not kitchen rites. What we can say with confidence is that the title Magus belonged to male priests, that kings elevated the magi in public ceremonies, and that the social need for small ritual acts remained where it began, in women's hands. When Anahita rose in royal favor, artisans carved and scribes recorded, but devotion traveled best by habit. Women who drew water before dawn and stored it carefully were already practicing a quiet theology of purity and care. If a queen sent offerings to a sanctuary of the river goddess, the impulse resonated downward as a validation of labor usually ignored. We do not have a roll call of noble women as temple officers. We do have a pattern in which royal policy sanctified elements that women managed every day. That alignment helped women frame their work as holy, even when the official priesthood remained a male estate. The great kings favored tombs that raised their silhouettes against the rock. The rites around those tombs were recorded by historians and copied by courts. The ordinary deaths that filled the empire each season set another rhythm. In many Iranian communities, later described in detail, women led laments and organized the practical tasks of mourning. The Achaemenid sources do not catalogue such roles, but the continuity of later custom and the silence of male archives point in the same direction. The women who washed the living also washed the dead, guided food and fire through liminal days, and held households together until ritual time returned to normal. This domestic liturgy freed priests to keep public forms and kings to keep public faces. It also made women the first ministers of human need. That function granted them status inside the home and leverage over the moral atmosphere of their kin. It did not translate into office at the altar or inscription on the wall. It endured because every community required it, because the faith of an empire depends on the piety of kitchens. The religious order of Achaemenid Persia imposed rules that could burden and protect, exclude and empower. Women did not author the doctrines that governed their bodies, yet they learned to live within those rules, with a patience that became a kind of mastery. They timed petitions to periods of ritual eligibility. They used seclusion to secure rest. They converted household competence into moral authority, and when public priests denounced unsanctioned charms, women folded their whispers into prayers the priests would accept. What remains darkest in the record is what was most common in life. The priest's title, the king's inscription, the tablet's numbers have survived. The steady, faithful actions that carried water to the hearth, that guarded the doorway at night, and that kept fire alive are present only as a pressure on everything else. The empire's worship needed them. Its archives could not see them. An empire as wide as the Achaemenid realm did not run on a single law code. It ran on many. Satrapies kept their own legal habits. Judges wrote in Babylonian, Aramaic, or Demotic. Contracts followed local formulae. Royal authority hovered above these courts. But most disputes were settled close to home. This plural legal world offered room to maneuver and room to fall. Women learned both. In Babylonia, much of the written law that scribes copied in the Persian period inherited provisions from older Mesopotamian traditions. Those traditions treated sexual offenses as attacks on household honor and property, often with severe penalties. The classical example is earlier Babylonian law that prescribed death for adultery, a rule whose spirit still colored expectations in local courts under later empires. Achaemenid practice did not erase such habits. It allowed them to persist where communities upheld them. The danger for women was clear. A rumor could start in a courtyard. A judge could read from an older precedent. Lives could hinge on the will of a husband or a local notable who chose mercy. Elsewhere, the same empire produced very different outcomes. In Aramaic marriage contracts from Elephantine in Persian Egypt, wives and husbands could both initiate divorce. If a husband filed, he owed compensation and the return of the dowry. If the wife filed, she might owe a financial return, but she was not subject to lethal punishment for adultery in those documents. The papyri show practical legal equality in the mechanics of divorce and property, at least within that colony's norms. The contrast exposes the patchwork in which women lived. A Persian subject at Elephantine could claim rights that a woman in a Babylonian town might not. The absence of Persian legal formularies from the imperial heartland complicates the picture. We do not yet possess sets of signed marriage or inheritance contracts from Persepolis itself. What we have instead are administrative tablets that record rations, travel, and work. The fortification archive shows the state's hand in provisioning and in counting women as recipients and supervisors. It does not show judges ruling on marriage or adultery in Persepolis proper. What follows is therefore a historian's careful inference. Imperial policy favored continuity of local law. Women's legal risk depended on where they lived and which scribal tradition recorded their case. When disputes crossed a satrap's desk, petitioners learned the language of caution. The Aramaic letters from Bactria and Sogdiana, written under Artaxerxes III and Darius III, preserve the tone of provincial government. They are short, formal, and precise about goods, guards, or permissions. Names of women are rare, yet the format itself matters. It shows how one asked for redress in a Persian office. It models the careful courtesy a woman would adopt if she had to write through a mail agent to a clerk who could close a file with one line of ink. Within households, the law took on the color of honor. A husband's accusation could trigger both legal and social penalties. Even where a court might allow a divorce rather than blood punishment, the social cost could be permanent. Guardianship, custody of children, and control of a woman's dowry could slip to male kin. In a world where reputation governed marriage alliances, a charge could end not only one partnership, but also narrow all future prospects. Women responded by building networks of witnesses and documents. They learned which neighbors would testify, which stewards could confirm deliveries, which scribes could copy a receipt that proved a journey was official and not a tryst. This is the practical survival skill behind so many seals in the Persepolis archive. A seal is not only authority, it is proof against slander. If law in the provinces pressed from below, palace politics pressed from above. Royal women stood near the fire of succession, where gossip burned hottest. Greek authors tell stories of queens like Amestris acting with vengeance and cruelty. Their tales are laced with bias, yet they register a real danger. Court accusations did not play out in village courts. They played out in rooms where eunuchs held keys and royal guards stood nearby. There, the law of survival was proximity to the king. A whisper could become a sentence. A rumor could become exile for a rival's household. The image of the eunuch as a neutral guardian of women had legal weight. He controlled access. He carried messages. He could tilt a dispute by opening or closing a door. Eunuchs also appear in more public roles. Bagoas, the powerful chamberlain under Artaxerxes III, emerges in our sources as a kingmaker. His career belongs to the political stage, yet his presence in nearly every account of late Achaemenid court maneuvering reminds us what women faced inside those halls. When a single courtier could make and unmake princes, a queen or princess relied on alliances with the same men to keep her children safe and her rivals contained. Legal risk at court was not a matter of statutes, it was a matter of alliances and timing. This world of risk forced women to develop legal literacy. In Elephantine, a woman could appear in a contract as a property owner and signatory. She could initiate a divorce and claim her share. In Babylonia, a widow could manage her late husband's goods, but might require male witnesses to alienate certain assets. In the imperial archive, a woman's name attached to a ration list could open way stations and payrolls to her entourage. Across these contexts, the same strategy repeats. Put your claim in writing if you can. Insist on a seal. Travel with a document that names your destination and purpose. Each inscription pins risk to a surface. Punishment remained the darkest edge. Where older Near Eastern law codes continued to inspire judges, adultery and certain assaults could draw extreme penalties. Where community practice had softened, a divorce settlement and the return of a dowry might end a marriage without blood. The danger for women was the unpredictability of a plural empire. The same act could be judged as a property dispute in one court and as a capital crime in another. Wise families learned local custom before they tested it. Women learned which elders to approach, which temple steward knew the judges, and which satrapal official might accept a petition that saved a life. Even queens faced the humiliation of medical secrets becoming political leverage. Herodotus tells how Atossa hid a breast tumor until she was desperate, then trusted a Greek physician held at court. Her illness became a pretext for that physician to ask favors that shaped foreign policy. Whether or not that chain of cause is true, the story reveals how a woman's private risk could become public bargaining in a legal and political arena she did not control. The same principle holds for ordinary women whose bodies, marriages and dowries formed the substance of other people's arguments. Everything we can read tells us this. Achaemenid women lived under many laws at once. They studied how to pass among them. They gathered witnesses, marks and seals. They formed quiet alliances with gatekeepers who turned petitions into outcomes. They endured the old punishments where they lingered. They claimed newer rights where a contract allowed. To survive was to read the map of risk. To protect a child, an estate or a name was to keep that map updated with every rumor from the court and every new clerk in the satrap's office. If the household was a woman's fortress, the road was her gamble. The Achaemenid Empire prided itself on motion. Royal couriers, tax convoys and caravans stitched the provinces together. Herodotus described the royal road from Sardis to Susa, nearly 2,700 kilometers long, with way stations for fresh horses and secure lodging every stage. This highway was not only for kings. Officials, merchants and their families used its safer stretches to cross the empire's heart. For women, these routes opened chances for trade, pilgrimage and reunion, but also exposed them to surveillance and danger. The fortification tablets at Persepolis confirmed that women did travel under the empire's watch. Some tablets list female supervisors and their entourages moving from one storage center to another. They received measured rations of grain and wine, the same logistical treatment as couriers or soldiers. One text even records a woman named Irdabama dispatching teams across Fars and beyond. Another names her agent, Artazostre, provisioning groups of women on the road. The precision, dates, quantities, destinations reveals an official network that allowed certain women to move securely inside the imperial system. Their freedom was bureaucratic, permission printed in clay. Ordinary women, without seals or letters of credit, traveled under male guardianship or attached to caravans. Law and custom treated them as dependents. Bandits and unscrupulous officials treated them as opportunity. Security on the roads was uneven. Patrols protected the royal mail, not the anonymous trader. When Greek observers claimed that Persian women never travel without curtains or escorts, they were not exaggerating court etiquette. They were describing the empire's hierarchy of safety. Long-distance trade mixed peril and possibility. Women at various levels participated in its logistics. The fortification texts mention female laborers and supervisors in transport and storage, and Greek sources describe women in Asia Minor running inns and managing local markets. In estates owned by royal women, female teams processed wine and textiles for export. The empire's wealth depended on these supply chains, yet its ideology left their operators invisible. A few traces pierce that invisibility. Aramaic letters from Bactria include references to the delivery of clothing and provisions by the women of the household of a Persian official, likely wives or servants responsible for preparing goods before shipment. The scribes did not find their names important. The state did. Each bale and skin was counted. Behind every shipment marched the labor of spinners, washers, and packers, many of them female. Not every journey was commercial. The growth of Anahita's cult and the maintenance of regional fire temples encouraged travel for worship. Women are not listed as priests, but dedications and votive objects from later Iranian sanctuaries often bear female names. It is reasonable to assume that noble women sponsored rites or visited shrines, escorted by retainers and eunuchs. A journey to Ecbatana or Susa could blend piety with politics, a petition offered to a governor along the way, a marriage alliance negotiated in a host's hall. Travel thus became a theatre of negotiation, half sacred, half strategic. Among commoners, pilgrimage shaded into petition. In frontier provinces like Bactria or Egypt, people seeking justice sometimes carried written appeals to a satrap or royal agent. A widow traveling with such a tablet might present herself at a waystation clerk's desk to request rations. Her route, her safety, even her food depended on bureaucratic mercy. Each mark of authorization on the tablet was a shield against suspicion of flight or espionage. Movement offered opportunity but also stigma. A woman traveling alone could be read as immoral or rebellious. Law codes preserved from Mesopotamian contexts sometimes penalized women who left their husbands' homes without permission, and those habits likely persisted. Inscriptions and Greek anecdotes portray Persian noblewomen who ventured far from court as exceptional. Even queens traveled veiled in covered litters. Their visibility was both spectacle and scandal. For lower-status women, mobility often followed loss, widowhood, displacement after war, or enslavement. Captives marched along the same roads as merchants. The empire's traffic mixed triumphal processions with human misery. For every lettered official's wife crossing provinces in a curtained wagon, dozens of anonymous women trudged behind carts, sold or traded across satrapies. The Achaemenid frontier was porous. Traders and envoys moved between Lydia, Egypt, Bactria, and India. Greek physicians, Phoenician craftsmen, and Babylonian scribes served in Persian domains. This cosmopolitanism brought cultural exchange that touched women's lives. New textiles, perfumes, and medicinal practices spread along the same roads. Elite women could sample foreign luxuries. Common women might learn cures or crafts from strangers. Yet the same openness carried fear of contamination, moral, ritual, and political. Zoroastrian purity law treated contact with foreigners dead as defilement, and xenophobic suspicion sometimes shadowed travelers. Women bore the social cost. Their virtue became the frontier of the empire's identity. When women could not travel, they sent words instead. The Aramaic correspondence of the empire shows how petitions and family news moved by relay. Couriers carried sealed scrolls. Recipients verified senders by seal impressions. A noblewoman could thus speak across provinces without leaving her estate. Yet her message passed through men's hands at every stage: scribes, guards, messengers, and officials who read before delivering. Privacy, the privilege of modern writing, did not exist. Every letter was public performance wrapped in deference. For lower-status women, oral message chains replaced written ones. A caravan's cook, a mercenary's wife, a trader's servant might carry greetings or requests from one household to another. Such informal networks kept families connected over hundreds of miles. They also transmitted rumor, scandal, and news. In that circulation, women became the empire's unacknowledged communicators, the gossip that foreshadowed decrees. Mapping women's mobility reveals a geography of privilege. From Sardis to Susa, royal roads were secure corridors for couriers and nobles. Outside them stretched regions of partial order where tribal, local, and bandit powers held sway. The empire tolerated these gaps so long as tribute and information flowed. Women understood the map instinctively, where a sealed pass could open doors, where a bribe bought silence, where night travel was folly. Their knowledge was oral, practical, and essential. Travel in ancient Persia thus embodied the contradictions of female life under empire, bounded yet vital, dangerous yet necessary. The same road that carried queens in gilded carriages bore enslaved captives in chains. The same bureaucratic clay that recorded official rations concealed stories of exhaustion, childbirth, and fear. To move was to risk, to stay was to disappear. Empires build walls of stone, but the mind is a quieter architecture. The Achaemenid Empire left behind its palaces, fortifications, and edicts, yet it did not record the thoughts of its people. Nowhere in the fortification tablets or royal inscriptions do we hear a woman speak for herself. There are no diaries, no poems in their own words, no recorded prayers whispered in private chambers. And yet, through art, ritual, myth, and the margins of men's writing, we can trace the outlines of women's inner worlds, their fears, faith, longing, and imagination. Historians must read silence as evidence. Where a culture's men wrote laws and ledgers, women's emotions filtered into oral tradition and gesture. An Achaemenid noblewoman might not have been free to sing laments publicly, yet she could commission a carved perfume vessel, a woven tapestry, or an amulet for her child, each one a confession of care disguised as duty. Across Persia's vast empire, from Lydia to Bactria, Egypt to Sogdia, women lived within differing emotional climates. A Babylonian widow governed her late husband's estate. An Ionian concubine waited for a letter from Susa. A Persian wife spun linen in Persepolis. Their emotional worlds were local, yet their constraints were shared. Love, jealousy, loyalty, faith. These feelings obeyed the same boundaries as law and class. Love outside marriage was sin. Anger within marriage was silence. Joy could be celebrated only through service to the gods or the family's honor. Greek sources like Herodotus or Xenophon tell stories of luxurious Eastern women swathed in jewels and perfume. Yet in the fortification tablets, we find a different truth. Measured distributions of oil and incense given to women for ritual use. These were not indulgences. They were necessities for purification and offering. Their fragrance masked labor, not leisure. Each oil jar was part of a small, quiet ritual that allowed women to feel clean, sacred, and presentable in a world that often reduced them to roles. Objects became the emotional vocabulary of women in ancient Persia. Jewelry carried prayers for fertility and safety. Archaeologists have found pendants shaped like eyes or crescents across Achaemenid strata, charms of protection. Rings bore carved animals, especially lions and birds, representing strength and the soul. These were not mere ornaments. They were silent allies, keeping anxiety and misfortune at bay. Clothing, too, held meaning. A noblewoman's robe was not only a marker of wealth, but also an emotional armor. When she wore woven gold-threaded linen, she wore her husband's status and her own self-respect. A slave's woolen dress, coarse and unadorned, told her of her subjugation every morning. For both, fabric was fate made visible. Among the few artistic depictions believed to represent women from this era, engraved gems, cylinder seals, and fragments of painted pottery. We see them as guardians, dancers, or supplicants. Each figure is poised in stillness, as if their creators understood that a Persian woman's grace was measured in restraint. What did women dream of in ancient Persia? The sources are mute, but human patterns persist. The Zoroastrian cosmology that matured in this period promised moral order, asha, and eternal consequence. For women, that doctrine offered both hope and fear. Righteousness could redeem suffering, but impurity could doom the soul. When night fell over Persepolis, beyond the torches of guards and scribes, women of all ranks lived their private lives. In the workers' quarters, mothers told stories of Fravashis, the guardian spirits of ancestors who protected the living. In noble houses, women performed quiet invocations for their children's health. Dreams were seen as omens. A vivid vision could carry divine advice. A wife might dream of water, a sign of fertility, and pray to Anahita the next morning. Or she might dream of fire and fear divine displeasure. Such dreams had consequence. In later Avestan texts, which carry echoes of Achaemenid belief, the soul's purity determined its fate after death. Women who managed domestic purity were thus guardians of both earthly and spiritual order. Their labor in cleaning, cooking, and worship was not only work, it was theology enacted by hand. Each vessel washed, each hearth swept, each drop of clean water poured was an act of cosmic maintenance. The Persian court, for all its ceremony, was a cauldron of human desire. Greek writers depict harems as dens of intrigue and lust, but Persian administrative reality treated them as family institutions, complex households of wives, concubines, servants, and attendants. Still, emotions could not be legislated. Love, rivalry, and yearning thrived behind the curtains. A favored concubine could rise in influence, a queen could be haunted by jealousy. The price of misdirected affection could be fatal, as seen in the Greek accounts of Amestris and Xerxes' forbidden affair. Outside the palace, desire's boundaries were social rather than royal. Marriage was both contract and expectation. In some Aramaic documents, wives stipulated that if husbands took additional partners, compensation or divorce would follow. This legal clause reveals a silent truth. Women feared not sex itself, but replacement, the erasure of their identity and security. Music was the safest expression of emotion. Reliefs and later Greek commentaries describe Persian banquets with flutes, lyres, and drums. While male musicians were public, female performers existed in private gatherings, in noble houses and temple festivities. Their songs, passed down orally, are lost, but ancient Near Eastern parallels suggest themes of love, exile, and the turning of fate. In such songs, women could articulate grief and hope under the guise of entertainment. Textiles, too, offered escape through creation. Achaemenid women were famed weavers. They spun gold threads, embroidered hunting scenes, and wove motifs of lions and flowers for export across the empire. Every stitch was repetition, meditation, control. Through textile work, women built beauty from monotony, a psychological coping mechanism disguised as craft. Despite patriarchy, the persistence of Anahita's worship suggests that Persian women found spiritual validation in her image. The goddess of water and fertility was independent, armored, and radiant, qualities absent from male ideals of womanhood. Her temples along major rivers became spaces where women could pray without male mediation. Some scholars argue that votive figurines of clothed women found near springs in Iran and Armenia reflect domestic devotion to Anahita. Even if the state priest did not appoint female clergy, everyday piety elevated her as the celestial reflection of womanhood itself. For many, she embodied justice and mercy, a counterbalance to the empire's hierarchy. The poor could pray to her for water and childbirth. The rich could dedicate jewels in her name. She was accessible and pure, both unreachable and intimate. Through her, women glimpsed an image of strength they could claim as divine heritage. The inner world of Persian women remains invisible, but not unknowable. It lingers in the symbols they chose, the rituals they maintained, and the quiet endurance that kept empire and household functioning side by side. Their dreams did not survive in text, but their consequences did. In the children who carried stories, in the fabrics traded across continents, in the continuity of domestic worship that persisted long after the Achaemenids fell. Every empire leaves monuments. Women leave memory. Their unseen feelings shaped the moral climate of the home and, in turn, the spirit of the empire itself. Behind the masks of order and law, they kept alive a civilization's most fragile truth, that meaning resides not in conquest or inscription, but in care, imagination, and the will to endure. When the empire began to crack, the sound reached women's ears first. They felt it in shortages of grain, in the slower arrival of rations from the treasury, in the silent return of husbands and sons from distant garrisons. Long before Alexander's banners appeared on the horizon, Persian women sensed the decay of certainty. The ledgers that once ensured their food and pay began to falter. The great bureaucratic rhythm that had fed both palace and worker stumbled, and with it, the fragile protection that had surrounded them for 2 centuries. By the late 4th century BCE, rebellions in Egypt, satrapal revolts in Anatolia, and succession struggles at court drained the empire's strength. The fortification archive ends abruptly around 493 BCE. Later documents survive only in fragments. The great machine of administration that once named and numbered women in its clay record fell silent. Women who had managed estates and laborers, like the heirs of Erdabama, found themselves caught between satraps claiming independence and the center trying to reclaim loyalty. Taxes rose, caravans were raided, law became uneven. In provincial temples, priests demanded higher offerings. In noble houses, supplies grew thin. The empire's decline was not only a tale of kings and generals, it was a crisis in kitchens, looms, and cradles. In Susa, Babylon, and Sardis, women who had once lived under predictable ration systems began to barter and beg. For noble families, decline took the shape of uncertainty. Shifting alliances, suspicious glances, marriages hurried to secure protection. For the poor, it was hunger. The cosmic order of Asher, once upheld by ritual purity and kingly justice, frayed into anxiety and improvisation. When Alexander of Macedon invaded in 334 BCE, he entered an empire already hollowed by exhaustion. Greek chroniclers fixate on battles, but for Persian women, the conquest arrived as rumor and dread. Word spread along the royal road. Sardis had fallen, the great king Darius III was retreating, satraps were defecting. Royal women in Susa and Persepolis faced a new humiliation. When Alexander captured the Persian royal family after the Battle of Issus, 333 BCE, he famously treated Darius's wife, mother, and daughters with courtesy. Arrian and courteous Rufus recount how they mistook his companion Hephaestion for the king and begged forgiveness for their error, an anecdote repeated for its gallantry. But behind the Greek moralizing lay the humiliation of Persian queens, displayed as trophies of empire. Their bodies symbolized Persia's defeat. Ordinary women suffered the occupation differently. Greek soldiers, following the chaos of conquest, plundered villages, burned estates, and enslaved captives. Those captured were sold in marketplaces from Tyre to Babylon. In one ancient account, Alexander freed several Persian noblewomen captured by his own soldiers, a gesture of magnanimity that doubled as propaganda. For every woman spared, countless others vanished into slavery or displacement. The most symbolic act came in 330 BCE, the burning of Persepolis. Ancient writers debate whether it was drunken revenge for the destruction of Greek temples or a calculated political act. Whatever its motive, the flames consumed what remained of women's recorded history. The clay archives baked into preservation decades earlier were spared only by chance. The papyri, the textiles, the painted walls, the uncounted names perished. Imagine the scene. Noble women of the court, veiled and silent, watching the glow rise from terraces that had sheltered them for generations. Servants wailed, guards fled, eunuchs broke seals on storage rooms trying to save treasure. The carved stone bulls of the gate turned red in the firelight. Within hours, centuries of order dissolved into ash. For the women of Persepolis, the burning marked both an ending and a liberation. The system that had defined their place bound them to purity and silence and measured their value in rations and seals was gone. Many would become dependents of new Greek administrators. Some would marry Macedonian officers. Others, especially artisans and servants, would vanish into the mixed populations of new Hellenistic cities. Yet something endured. The habits of devotion, the rituals of cleanliness and fire, the domestic piety that had once ordered Achaemenid homes did not vanish with the palaces. Archaeologists trace the continuity of these customs into the Parthian and Sasanian eras. Women still tending household fires, still invoking the waters of Anahita, still teaching prayers about truth and justice to their children. In art and legend, the image of the noble Persian woman softened but persisted, graceful, moral, veiled, yet powerful. The Anahita temples that dotted Armenia and Media after Alexander's conquest kept alive the old vision of feminine divinity. Through her, the memory of the women who had managed estates, guarded families, and survived conquest lived on as sacred archetype. Even as Hellenistic rulers claimed to civilize Persia, their courts adopted Persian customs, perfumes, textiles, veils, and household etiquette, most of them maintained by women. Greek queens like Roxana and later Seleucid princesses absorbed these traditions, blending Macedonian and Persian expectations of female virtue. The conquerors' wives became vessels of cultural memory, carrying forward Persian domestic aesthetics long after the empire itself fell. Zoroastrianism also persisted, adapting to new rulers and integrating older female roles into its evolving theology. Women continued to serve as guardians of household ritual purity, an echo of their Achaemenid ancestors' unseen ministry. Through this endurance, Persian womanhood outlasted conquest, less as a social privilege than as a moral practice, a faith in order amid chaos. In the end, the dark secrets of women's lives in ancient Persia are not merely tales of suffering. They are also secrets of survival, how quiet acts of endurance built the emotional scaffolding of an empire. The clay tablets recorded grain, women recorded continuity. The kings raised inscriptions to truth, women kept truth alive in families and faith. When we read those tablets now, we touch the fingertips of the women who pressed seals beside men's. We hear the whisper of mothers teaching daughters how to survive among rules they did not write. We see that beneath empire's splendor and collapse lay an invisible order that never quite burned away. The empire of kings fell in fire. The empire of women endured in memory. From clay and silence, from fire and memory, emerges a simple truth. In ancient Persia, women's lives were neither wholly hidden nor wholly free. They existed in tension between reverence and repression, voice and veil. Yet within that tension, they forged a civilization's continuity. Empires burn, but the unseen labor of women, the tending of hearths, the keeping of faith, the endurance of the heart, survives every conqueror.